Good afternoon, everyone. I apologize for not being with you in person. I much would have been there, but it's a busy day down here in the 26th district in Delaware County. I'm coming to you from beautiful Upper Darby in my office here, and we are, I know it's been a great day so far. We're looking forward to some great presentations this afternoon. So basically, the next presentation is about recognizing and preserving municipalities' equity in local utilities systems. And our presenter is Jens Damgaard. For most municipalities, local water and sewer systems are their most valuable assets. In addition to public parking, the revenue generating potential of local water and sewer systems typically make the most valuable assets of a municipality. So Jens is a member of Eckert Siemens, Charen and Mellott, public finance lawyer with more than 30 years of experience representing school districts, counties, municipalities, and municipal authorities in tax-exempt and structured financings for a variety of public projects. Thank you, Jens, for joining us today. Looking forward to this.
As you heard, I'm a lawyer, and my area of expertise is in what they call public finance. So typically what I'm called is bond counsel. And knowing the ins and outs of the documents dealing with financings comes in very handy whenever you're looking at whether or not a particular asset can be sold or leased or whatever. So in the course of my career, I've seen a lot of things and seen a lot of need for analyzing when something where an asset can turn into money to contribute to the well-being of a particular municipality. So I'd like to tie it in a little bit with what we heard or so far today. Of course, we heard the first group from Lansdale. They were very proud of what they did and deservedly so. It was a very impressive project. And one of the things they said, well, we reactivated our parking authority and we appointed a member of council on the parking authority, and they took a big lead in this modernization of the downtown. And that's the strategy there was, okay, now you've kind of locked in the politics and the priorities of the current board, and now you'll see it preserved on the authority board. And there's a lag there. There's obviously, the municipality appoints the members annually. Let's say it's a 5-member board. So that, each year another appointment. So there's a lag in the membership on the authority to reflect the priorities of the municipality. In that case, it worked. But look, if you're a member of council and that authority no longer reflects your priorities, that you're trying to do something. Imagine the council saying, maybe we want to sell or lease or privatize one of the parking garages that the authority has. The authority might not be too keen on that, and that leads to some issues, both political and legal, potentially. Likewise, you heard from the Economy League, a big part of every analysis, including Act 47, is where are the value, where's the assets, what are potential monetization? That's the favorite word used now in any kind of analysis when you're looking at municipal distress or substituting for the limited tax base. So some of the things we're going to talk about. So as was said, typically the water sewer system, sometimes parking, but that's usually left to cities or maybe large boroughs, but it's the water and sewer systems, particularly the water system. It's probably the most valuable asset in the local community. And what happened when it was originally set up, the reason it is what it is today is because the municipality many years ago may have put in some seed money, but more importantly, what it did was it said, okay, they had a customer base that was provided and a given. and they mandated connection to this system. So that they created a monopoly that was able to then create the financial wherewithal for this system to grow and thrive and eventually grow into other municipalities. But it was that core group started with the original city, the original borough, wherever it was, then that enabled that to grow. And it was that monopoly power that is a large part of the value of it. Once people are hooked up to it, they tend not to unhook to it. So even whatever you do, if you're going to sell it or whatever, you have a variable asset that stays that way. So why are we talking about this in particular today is because these things, these utility systems become very valuable. In the last few years, and why is because of a law change, in part because of a law change that took place in 2016, where it now allows through a PUC, Pennsylvania Public Utility Commission process, private companies can now, if they go through the right steps, buy a municipal system for market value and pay the cost of that spread over a bigger customer base, not just the customer base of the one that they're buying. So by this wide base, they're able to offer more money. And we're seeing that by bigger and bigger offers by private investor-owned utilities to buy these water and sewer systems. So what that process is often results from a request for proposals. Municipality, whatever, hires a consultant. They come in and say, okay, we're going to put it out to a bid. Maybe an RF, request for qualifications, request for proposals. That's typically the way it works. And that's gotten the attention not only of the private companies, it's gotten the attention of some of the larger municipal authorities. You say, hey, maybe growth is not such a bad idea, or we don't like the idea of these private companies kind of getting into our territory, whatever. And they're able to offer a lot of money as well, because of course, assumably they already have a customer base. They're just going to grow it. And likewise, they have the advantage of, they have those same, in cooperation with the municipalities, this monopoly power that they can force people to connect that the privates don't necessarily have. It's controversial whether they do, but clearly the municipalities and the authorities through the municipalities do. And the authorities can come and say, hey, wouldn't you rather deal with us? We're nonprofit. Trust us, we're the white knight, go with us. So they're making offers on these RFPs. So they're in the game too. Again, bidding up these prices. So, but what happened is years ago when these systems were built, the municipalities gave them away. And who did they give them to? They gave them to a municipal authority that they set up at that time. And it made a lot of sense too, why they did that. If you go back to prior to the 1970s, municipalities were very limited in how much money they could borrow. They were limited to a formula based on the assessed value of the real estate within their boundaries. That law, the law that was changed in the 70s called the Local Government Unit Debt Act, and the Pennsylvania Constitution was amended as well to change that from an assessed value formula to a average revenue-based formula. So municipalities can now borrow more than they did then, but the allure and the benefit of authorities are still there, not so much in terms of borrowing, but what it's evolved to more toward is an important part of it is avoiding PUC regulation over rate setting. So today, typically the PUC does not regulate rate setting by authorities, even if it goes outside of the incorporator's boundaries. Now there's some erosion of that, and that's for another conference, but generally speaking, that's the position. And that's a benefit for these authorities to say, don't, PUC process is very expensive and time consuming. I think it's pretty established. That's not unfair. So avoiding that is a big plus that with the authorities. So having that is still a plus for using an authority in some capacity, at least in rate setting. Rate setting. That doesn't necessarily mean ownership. And there are ways for the authority to set rates and not necessarily own the system. So here, the typical authority is what we call the operating authority, and that's the one that does everything. Sets the rates, it owns it, it operates it, it borrows the money. All those four elements is the operating authority, but those different elements can be sliced and diced. As long as the rate setting piece stays with the authority through a combination of agreements and leases and so on, you can still accomplish that important benefit, PUC avoidance, with other benefits potentially to the municipality. So what happens? Well, where are we today? Well, we've got this authority that's been running on its own probably very well. And I think authorities today are, for the most part, well run. People are well-meaning, they're board members and so on. I don't question that. But there does come times when the authority board is logically focused, not so much on what the municipality's interests or what they're doing. Their focus is on the customers. That's what they're taught. That's what their mantra is. You serve the customers. And I get it. That makes perfectly good sense. But what if the borough council has some different ideas? What if the board of supervisors have some different ideas? City council, whatever. That's where there's some potential tension. It's like, we're appointing you, but you're not necessarily reflecting our priorities. And that's, again, where there's tension. The other source of tension is when the city's authority grows out into the neighboring townships. Those townships and those neighbors don't necessarily all that concerned with the interests of what the city are, or the borough, whatever. And there's tension there, especially when the municipality starts talking about this monetization concept. So the bottom line is, it's very, very difficult for the municipality to generate any value to monetize without owning the system. You can talk about all this other, the municipality can provide services, municipality this and that. But at the end of the day, because of a change in law under the Authorities Act that makes it illegal for them to just hand money away, there has to be some value given that reflects what the authority is paying to the municipality. So it really means doing something more. It means selling it and getting a chunk of money up front, or doing something else that justifies some type of payments over time. So what we're talking about here is what happens when the municipality goes to the authority and says, we'd like to own the sewer system. We'd like to own the water system, even though the reservoir is 2 townships away. What are the rights of the municipality under those circumstances? So I say the battle lines are drawn, but it's because I've seen it. It's this tension between serving the customers versus serving the constituents of the municipality, the voters, the taxpayers. They're not always the same. The customers base and the tax base are not the same. So there's tension there, especially from outside the boundaries of the municipality and even within because of the lack of trust and so on. So you try to think about selling it. Well, the way the law is set up, that the value of a sale of that asset is going to go to the incorporator. And if that incorporator is the city only, the city gets all the money, even though most of the system's outside the city. And that does not seem fair to the customers and municipalities outside the city. The other side of it is the manager and the employees who have a big say in all this, they're not too keen on seeing things changed. Certainly not sold. There's their job, potentially. Or leased or something else. That's money they got to now include in their budget that they didn't have to before. Raise rates potentially, making for unhappy customers. So the law is, under the Authorities Act, that a municipality who appoints all the members of that authority have the right to acquire the assets of the authority if it can deal with the obligations of the authority beforehand. It's like you or I are going to buy a house. You got to make sure the mortgage on that house is taken care of. And it kind of works the same way here. The liens on the revenues associated with that sewer system have to be dealt with before you can transfer title, even to the municipality. It doesn't happen automatically. There are cases that say when the municipality acquires the water system, it doesn't automatically take over the bond issue because that affects third parties, the bondholders. So you got to deal with those. Normally that means you got to pay them off with a city bond issue or a borough bond issue, which is doable. And the mechanics of that will be another session, but it is doable, but it has to be dealt with. Or if the lenders are like Penvest or banks, where you have somebody you can talk to other than nameless, faceless bondholders, you can negotiate with them to transfer the lien in favor here over to the lien here. And that has been done successfully, but it has to be done. When you have a joint authority, where you have more than one member, it gets much more difficult. There's very little guidance, case law or otherwise, how does even if you're the majority, let's say you have a 9-member authority board and you appoint 6 of them, doesn't mean you you can control the thing or that you get 6/9 or whatever it is. It makes it more difficult, but I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm just saying it's more difficult. So here's the law I mentioned where it says, this is in the Authorities Act, 5622 says, by appropriate resolution or ordinance of the municipality just signifies its desire to acquire the assets, and the authority shall convey upon assumption by the municipality of all the obligations. And that's the rub, because typically the authority is going to assert you cannot assume this, or you can't pay off that, or we're going to set it up so you can't. The other thing is I told you that in these kind of situations, often there are impediments put in place to slow that process down or stop that process. There are powers in the Authorities Act, and I list the one here, where by resolution or ordinance, the municipality can specify the projects that can be undertaken by the authority, and no other project shall be undertaken. The dispute and the issue is, what does project mean? When can you tell the authority you can't do something that in furtherance of a particular project or its actions? So some recent cases have come out of the Commonwealth Court that I think, I think it's fair to say have been leaning toward the municipalities and less toward the authorities. Chester Water, Chester, the city of Chester has been in Act 47 forever and with a lot of problems. And I think as part of the plan, look to monetize your assets. And by far, the biggest asset they have is the water system that has over the years spread way out beyond the city of Chester, out and into Delaware and various municipalities in Chester and Delaware County. And when the city started to pursue that and talk about selling to Aqua, the legislature in 2012 amended the Authorities Act to change the board of the Chester Water Authority to go from 5 to 9 members, 3 from the city, 3 from Delaware County, 3 from Chester County, in a way to basically so that the city was now a minority on the board. So lawsuits ensued. Question is, the fact that the city lost a majority of the board from 100% to 33%, does that mean that 66% of the equity was given away to the 2 counties? In effect, control, in other words, if it was sold, value, or the ability to block it. Can this new board disregard the directives from the city that you shall now cooperate in a sale of that system? And what I'd be honest with you, I thought that that's what's going to happen. They were going to say, too bad, Chester, when they amended it, now you don't have that asset anymore. But the Commonwealth Court, remember that's our intermediate appellate court, said, no, just because you change the board and just because the city is now a minority on the board, the city itself, as the original incorporator, still has the right to the value of those assets. And now that's gone to the Supreme Court. But that was kind of basically saying, no, that still stays with the city. So that battle continues, but you can see that was kind of and I don't know what the thinking was. It just was unfair to take something from a poor city. I don't know what it was, but it was kind of a surprise in the lawyers doing what I do. The next one also came out this year, Delcora. County of Delaware, as you know, was Republican controlled for many years, and it would appear that it was going to flip control of the county commissioners in Delaware County. The authority, which had been appointed by all those, Republican commissioners all of these years, were in alignment, and there was this desire here. The authority wanted to sell and take the money and basically put it in an account and so on. When the commissioners flipped, the commissioner said, wait a second, we don't want you doing that. We don't want you selling. This is an asset we want to keep the county. Here the county is the sole incorporator. So the new commissioners passed an ordinance saying, we're going to take you over. We're going to control your assets. Don't do anything that's going to prevent that from happening. Kind of cease and desist from what you're trying to do, including disavowing an agreement that Delcora had already entered into with Aqua. So they kind of got that. And I was telling you, typically what happens is the authority or whoever acts to stop what's coming. Here, they entered into this agreement with Aqua and thought, well, it's too late for the county to stop it. But here, the Commonwealth Court, again, consistent with what we saw in Chester, said, no, just because, the commissioner, just because you entered into this contract and did all these things, and just because you don't agree with what the new commissioners want, Commissioners still have the right to acquire this system. You shall not do anything in furtherance of blocking it, in effect. You can read it for yourself. It says they directed an ordering Delcor to terminate its operations, wind up its affairs, satisfy its debts, take all actions necessary to remove any impediments to the termination, and refrain from taking any action expended funds. And what the court, again, the argument was that you can't tell them what to do. They're an independent body. They have their own, they're an independent corporate entity, the authority. But here, the court said, we conclude the ordinance is valid and enforceable to the extent it directs the termination and dissolution of Delcora and dictates that after termination is underway, Delcora must engage in conduct necessary to effectuate the transfer of its assets and the assumption of its liabilities to the county. Basically saying, you can't, these impediments you're putting in place to an extent, stop, except the bombshell is you already entered into this contract. So now the county is stuck with it. So the county can take the asset, but like your home, it's got to take the mortgage too, or in this case, the contract. So the lesson there is you act too slow, or, it's timing. You got to act before these impediments are put in place, or you have to live with them. So, the county has no choice but to abide and fully perform its obligations, else be potentially subject to a breach of contract sued by Aqua. Here's another situation. I was involved in this one. The borough of Lewistown sought to acquire the assets of the authority that it was the sole incorporator of. The authority didn't want to do that. The other municipalities fought about it. And in the end, there's litigation. And they end up settling, which is probably the way these really should be politically settled. Litigation is expensive. But here what they did was the county kind of got involved and created a new authority that would then acquire the system from the borough's authority and basically buy out the borough. So the borough now got $1 million and $300,000 a year for 30 years, plus inflation. So that was, you get an idea of like how that can work. So what are the takeaways from this? Since 2016, the value of these systems have greatly increased. Municipality does have that power to compel the acquisition of the assets and under Delcora case, compel them to cooperate. So if the things that the authority does, apparently other than enter into contracts with third parties, another common one is to issue bonds that can't be repaid. It's another strategy, these, to keep things from changing. As long as they don't involve a third party, they may be stopped. But if it involves a third party, you're pretty much stuck with the outcome. So that's, and that includes contracts or debt. A lot of times debt can be dealt with, sometimes bonds can't be prepaid for a certain period of time. You got to deal with those. That's where I often get involved in dealing with these trust indentures, what's required. Monetizing is a typical Act 47 part of that analysis. But in the end, the ultimate control, the ultimate resolution of this is by appointing authority members that will be sympathetic to the interests of the municipality. That can include appointing members of the board and the council or the board of supervisors, whatever. You can also appoint employees of the municipality to sit on the authority board. You might want to put some things in place to keep, so what happens if they're no longer an employee, now they're the disgruntled former employee, things you might want to do to put that in place. And it's a common strategy and it's legal. So again, that's where I think the municipalities are not focused on of who it is they're actually appointing. So that's it. Thank you for your attention. I don't know if we have any time. Looks like not.
Jens, thank you very much. We really do appreciate all your expertise, and it obviously hits close to home for me here in Delaware County.
Yes.
With the two you described, and I might actually follow up with some questions later on the Del Coro one in particular. But
Sure.
I thank you for joining us today. I meant to say this earlier, but the commission, the actual local government commission, is by far the most sort of bipartisan place in the Capitol, and it's all about how the state government interacts with local government. So I really do appreciate getting experts like yourself to come in and talk to us about these issues.
My pleasure. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I hope everybody's enjoying the sessions thus far. I'm very pleased to introduce our next panel. We have Pat Berger and Kris Latta, the Executive Director and Deputy Executive Director for the Pennsylvania Legislative Budget and Finance Committee. They do a lot of good work and really critical studies for the General Assembly and provide the members with important information about policy matters, and they've been doing it in that excellent manner for quite some time. 2021 Senate Resolution 146 had the Pennsylvania Legislative and Budget and Finance Committee take a look at sovereign immunity and local political subdivision tort immunity and the limitations thereon, and they are here today to present the results of their studies on that particular issue. So thank you both for being with us today.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Hutchinson and the members of the commission for inviting us to participate in this symposium. As Director Green already mentioned, we had this project through a Senate resolution, so I will skip that introductory piece and get right to the part of defining sovereign immunity. Sovereign immunity can be traced to a common law doctrine based on the idea that the king could do no wrong. In modern context, it refers to the idea that a government, the sovereign, cannot be sued without its consent. Similarly, governmental immunity, which is the discussion piece that we're going to focus on this afternoon, although our report did include sovereign immunity and governmental immunity, is for local government entities within the state, such as cities, townships, and authorities. Governmental immunity limits liability for claims against local governments to $500,000 per incident. This has not been changed since it was established in 1978. We were tasked with this study as the result of two Pennsylvania Supreme Court opinions. In Zoflick v. Pennsbury School District and Grove v. Port Authority of Allegheny County, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court addressed the issue as to whether the current statutory limitations on liability infringe on the constitutional right to a jury trial guaranteed by Article 1, Section 6 of the Constitution of Pennsylvania. In both cases, the court upheld the caps, but acknowledged the court could be faced with a case in which the limitations could render cost prohibitive a plaintiff's right to a jury trial. The court also acknowledged the superior capacity of the General Assembly to evaluate questions of public policy inherent in any possible need to change the caps. Further, Article 1, Section 11 of the Constitution of Pennsylvania vests with the General Assembly the sole authority to determine how and in what cases lawsuits against the Commonwealth are to be brought. Kris Latta, who is with me today, is both our Deputy Executive Director, but he was also the project manager on this project. And I will turn it over to Kris to discuss our findings and recommendations.
Thank you. We developed the following objectives regarding governmental immunity for our study, and they were as follows: to examine the impact on plaintiffs of the current limitations on liability, to examine the impact of changing the limitations on liability on state and local government entities, including the ability of state and local government entities to raise revenues and provide services, benefits, and programs, to review the factors contained in the Joint State Government Commission's 1978 report on the recommendations of the Task Force on Sovereign Immunity as they relate specifically to caps on recovery and waivers of sovereign and governmental immunity, to consider any other factors that will allow the General Assembly to evaluate and determine whether the limitations on liability should be increased. To accomplish these objectives, we did the following: to determine the impact of changing the liability limitation on local government entities, LBFC staff interviewed various local government associations, local government entities, and municipal risk pools. To review as much data as possible through the duration of the current $500,000 cap on liability, we obtained and analyzed over 118,000 claims from the sources we interviewed, and those claims came from the scope of 1978 to 2021. We also reviewed current limitations on local government entities on their ability to raise revenue, issue debt, and to file for bankruptcy. We also spoke to associations that represent school districts, municipal authorities, local governments, and transit authorities. We spoke with representatives of the risk pools, an association that represents the commercial insurance industry, a risk pool reinsurer, a regional transportation authority, and a large city. Further, we developed a local government entity survey structured to include qualitative and quantitative questions. To assess other factors for the General Assembly to consider, we reviewed other states' most recent changes to respective sovereign and governmental immunity laws, damage cap structures, and transparency and reporting structures. To examine the impact on plaintiffs of the current limitations on liability, LBFC staff interviewed individuals involved in 3 tort claims against an entity created by the Commonwealth itself, and citizens of Philadelphia brought by the city of Philadelphia for the purpose of reducing the initial award. For example, the local government case involved 85 households that suffered property damage because of a water main break in Philadelphia. Because of the $500,000 cap, homeowners received only 60% of their claim, which had already been reduced and then approved by the city. Based on our extensive research, data collection, and analysis, we found the following related to governmental immunity. First, the current $500,000 cap is sufficient for over 99% of claims against the local government entities we reviewed. Local government entities are limited by state law in their ability to generate revenue, issue debt, and file for bankruptcy. That was the second finding, sorry. The third, the ability of local government entities to adjust revenues and or services provided if liability caps were to be eliminated or increased varies greatly based on many different factors, such as state law, current revenue sources, the tax base, fiscal health, and local priorities. Number 4, as shown in sections 2 and 3 of our report, the statutory caps play no significant role for the vast majority of plaintiffs. However, for those few who have been catastrophically injured by government entities subject to the caps, the limitations on liability have devastating health and or financial consequences. For the local government entities, number 5, for the local government entities responding to our survey, we found A, over 50% have property and liability insurance coverage through a commercial insurer. B, over 90% agree or strongly agree that insurance coverage will become prohibitively expensive in Pennsylvania if all damage caps are eliminated or increased based on inflation. And C, if all damage caps were eliminated or increased based on inflation, Over 80% of local government entities agree or strongly agree that it is likely there will be a negative impact on services provided to the community. D, if all damage caps were eliminated or increased based on inflation, local government entities indicated that general government, highways and streets, and culture and recreation are the three main budget areas that would be most affected. E, if all damage caps were eliminated or increased based on inflation, over 75% of local government entities agree or strongly agree their municipality will likely have to increase taxes and fees. F, the survey response rate was approximately 5.4%, which is similar to other recent surveys of local governments conducted during the pandemic. Our sixth finding, in 2015, Maryland increased their cap to $400,000 to a single claimant for injuries from a single incident or occurrence for the state and its local government units. Colorado increased their caps and added an annual inflation adjustment, and 13 states have no cap for claims against the state, and 11 have no cap for claims against local governments. Our seventh finding, Pennsylvania does not have a reporting requirement for local government entities' liability claims data, and therefore there is a lack of transparency in the methods local government entities use to insure against liability. 8, the City of New York produces a web-based annual claims report, which is used to identify areas with high claims costs to reduce those costs and to work closely with city agencies to manage risk. And number 9, the damage cap set in 1978, which you recall was $500,000 per incident, would be equal to roughly $2.09 million in today's money. Based on our findings, we recommended the following. First, the General Assembly should consider developing new liability caps for economic damages to cover catastrophic claims. This cap should reflect the same purchasing power as the 1978 caps in today's dollars and should be adjusted for inflation going forward. Second, the General Assembly should consider maintaining the $500,000 cap for local government entities for non-catastrophic claims. Third, the House and Senate should also consider increasing the medical expenses threshold for non-economic damages by the same percentage increase as the increases for economic damages in catastrophic cases. Fourth, if the General Assembly chooses to make changes, it should review other states' most recent changes to their damage cap structures. Fifth, the General Assembly should consider requiring local government entities to report their insurance carrier for property and liability insurance coverage. We suggest using DCED's Municipal Statistics database, which currently captures statistics through a required e-filing form. Sixth, the General Assembly should direct appropriate resources to the Department of Community and Economic Development to establish and maintain a statewide reporting system for claims made against local governments. In closing, I'd like to acknowledge the cooperation we received from various municipal risk pools, local government entities, and the following associations: the County Commissioners Association of Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania School Boards Association, State Association of Boroughs, the Pennsylvania Municipal League, the Municipal Authorities Association, the Pennsylvania State Association of Township Supervisors, and the Insurance Federation of Pennsylvania in completing the section of this study on local governments. We'd also like to acknowledge and appreciate the cooperation we received from the staff of the Department of Community and Economic Development in the section of the study on local government and reporting. We also thank the counties, municipal governments, special district governments, school districts, and public transportation entities that participated in the local government entities survey. Additionally, we really appreciated the participation of Mr. Jim McLaughlin and Ms. Marla Rosenberg and Ms. Kathy Pernini in providing their personal accounts and related documents for the case study regarding local governments in our report. And finally, I'd be remiss If I didn't acknowledge the hard work of the analysts on our team, Ms. Stevie Sprankle, Ms. Shanika Mitchell St. John, and Mr. Rabanta Mukherjee. The report is posted on the LBFC website. If you'd like to check it out, it is at lbfc.legis.state.pa.us. And with that, we're happy to answer any questions you may have.
Pat and Kris, the 13 states that don't have any caps, is there a correlation between their municipal insurance rates and those in Pennsylvania? Is there a difference in the amount that they're paying for coverage given that they have no tort caps?
That type of information isn't readily available. It was actually pretty difficult getting the rates that our local municipalities pay for insurance. Survey?
Yeah, the survey.
Sure. Pat had mentioned the survey. There were several ways that municipalities insure themselves. Some are self-insured. The largest ones are self-insured. Some buy commercial insurance from same types of companies you and I would buy insurance from, and others participate in risk pools.
Well, thank you so much for participating this afternoon, Kris and Pat. We appreciate working with you, and we appreciate you being here and presenting the results of your report. We'll all check it out, and it will be available as well on your website and through the symposium materials as well. Thank you.
Sure thing. Thank you.
They're letting me walk away from the Zoom terminal for a little bit, so hopefully it doesn't break while I'm up here. But yeah, take it away, Dave.
Well, our final presentation tonight is by the commission staff itself. We will be presenting a full report later on to the members of the General Assembly. So this is just a brief summary of some of the results of our research on what happens when different agencies use different mapping systems to determine municipal boundary lines. The Local Government Commission staff presents their preliminary research on the multiple mapping systems used throughout the state and how these systems don't always create uniform boundary lines. So to do that, we have our Assistant Director and Legal Counsel, Kris Gazsi, and our Research Analyst, Jaren Bittinger, to present these preliminary results. So thank you, guys.
All right, and this is Jaren. I think this is your first time doing a session like this with us. I'm excited to have you up here.
I'm excited to be here.
All right, so I think what you're going to see today is pretty enlightening and different than a lot of the conversations that we tend to see in local government issues. And it's one that came across my desk when we were asked to participate in a working group, I don't know, maybe 6 or 7 years ago now, that began ad hoc between a number of different state agencies and some stakeholders outside the Commonwealth, talking about the fact that as the world gets increasingly more digital and we utilize more and more technology for the way that we administer government services and even beyond government services, really our commercial services as well, that data gets really, really messy. So what we're going to talk about today is not so specific as to the metes and bounds of municipal political boundaries in terms of their original text, because to a large extent, it's very difficult to translate that into proper mapping. A huge difference between those metes and bounds, because if you would go back in time and pull your charter for such and such a borough or such and such a township, you would find that very old text where you say, we put a monument at the corner of the municipality over here, then it's going to extend for a certain distance. And, at the oak tree, it made a 7-degree turn and things like that. And of course, that oak tree is not there anymore. And over time, folks have attempted to translate that into multiple different kinds of mapping resources, but it's really come to a head as we start to think about some newer services now, and we realize that there's pretty big discrepancies in that data, which leads to potential issues like, do our community members have a different expectation for where those boundaries look than maybe what the legal description of those boundaries really look like? And how do we respond in that kind of situation? Something that's really different about municipal boundaries versus, say, the parcel boundaries that you might have if you own your own real estate. Those parcel boundaries are surveyed and resurveyed, and they go through a certain quality process in the exchange of real estate, in the development of communities over and over and over again, because we change them more often, or we need to know exactly where is this boundary when I put up a fence. That kind of quality study tends to happen less often with our political boundaries. So to talk about some of those different sources of lines a little bit, I'm going to turn it over to Jaren, our newest research associate, to kind of set the scene for you a little bit. And then this is a visual presentation.
Thank you for that introduction, Kris. So as Kris mentioned, we looked at a variety of different agencies who use different maps. And that's really just because as this need for boundary data and this that's heavily reliant upon geospatial data increases, so too does the need for different maps. So we looked at, for this presentation, 3 separate organizations about. We looked at PennDOT's maps, we looked at Census's maps, as well as municipal county official maps. So to kind of start off with PennDOT, PennDOT uses a program called Munbound, which is their in-house statewide design file. It was originally created by the Cartographic Information Division, and really it's the information that is used by PennDOT to develop all of their maps. So a lot of the maps that they sell to the public that are available for public information are based off of those maps. Most importantly, that we looked at, Munbound is used to make determinations for the Municipal Liquid Fuels Program and those allocations. So those allocations come from the Motor License Fund and support the construction and maintenance of municipal roadways. And all that information that gets into Munbound is used to coordinate those allocations. Other departments also use Munbound and PennDOT's maps for various services as well. Munbound also includes information on cities, townships, as well as the other political boundaries and divisions and electoral districts. The other maps that we looked at belonged to the U.S. Census, specifically their Boundary Annexation Survey, or BAS for short. And really, that Census's version of their own Munbound. It's used to fulfill Census's responsibility for maintaining national data about legal government boundaries. BAS is optional, and so a lot of the problems that you might see as we go through these maps is that recent annexations by a municipality may not go reported to Census, which can lead to problems later on down the road. But Department of State, the Reapportionment Commission, and others are statutorily required to use census except instead of PennDOT. And so you see different organizations, different groups using different maps. The other groups then were municipalities and counties who adopt their own official maps. Of course, they are also then different from MUNBOUND and census. And as I mentioned before, they do often include those most recent changes.
Thanks. So let's take a look at how a conflict on these three sources of mapping might look in the real world. And I'm going to start with about as bad as it gets. So this is, I know, this is a borough. We are lightly masking the identity of communities because the point here is not to point a finger and say, wow, look at how big the problem is over here. Look at how the problem looks over here. But this is a borough. This is a borough that doesn't have a very large population, about 1,000 or 2,000 folks. I don't remember off the top of my head. But as you can see, the citizens of this borough are going to have a lot of trouble looking at various resources and understanding where the municipal property lines might actually lie. So do I have a laser? Well, I guess the laser doesn't help me if I'm showing it to the TV that I'm looking at that you can't see. So the green line is a reflection of MUNBOUND, and PennDOT has made available one of its software platforms called OneMap, which I know is not theirs specifically, but they utilize it, which has allowed us to basically go and take the polygon files that are published in a variety of sources and stack them one on top of another to do as best as we can to try to look at these various data sources together. So MUNBOUND is basically the information that PennDOT has pulled together, and that's the green line that's at the bottom of the stack of three. On top of that, we're showing the purple lines, which is the information that the Census Bureau maintains for this particular borough. And then finally, the county's own GIS department, their reflection of their official map is in orange on top of that. And one of the reasons why I wanted to start with this one is because I did want to outline a little bit about the scale of what this problem might look like in the real world. No boundary in this municipality is really aligned that well with itself. And in the upper corner, you see that I've done a little pop out using very advanced local government commission line drawing software. And you can see that in that gray map, and I don't know if you can see the smaller rectangles that are just a little bit of a different color. It's not a very high contrast map. There's actually 24 residences that appear in this strange shape that's created by the difference between the MUNBOUND boundary and the county boundary versus the census boundary. And this is a pretty exceptional pocket. This is 24 houses, maybe upwards of 75 to 100 people who live in a place where these contrasting sources, really say you live in one place or another. Well, in the real world, we have a situation where that census boundary, for purposes of the Pennsylvania Election Code, is the source of information that the Department of State is required to use in the election code in order to set out the precincts and voting districts and those kinds of things, despite the fact that there's a very high probability that those 24 houses are actually not in the borough as they would appear to be in this little purple line. That's kind of a pretty complex issue. Usually the problem doesn't look quite this large at a scale of population. Higher the population centers, usually the lower the specific problems. There's still a lot of other potential issues that can emerge from it. Moving on to our second map. These are two examples of places where we have specific information about an annexation that occurred at some historical point that is not uniformly presented across the record. Now, for common definition, when I say annexation, I'm talking about a piece of one municipality becoming a part of an adjacent municipality. This is distinct from either a merger or consolidation where two become one in one way. Both municipalities continue to exist, but a piece of one becomes a piece of another. Before the 1968 Constitution, there were a number of different statutes that allowed this to, happen in different circumstances. In the post-1968 statute regime, that's become a little bit different. It's now something that has, for the last 50 years, only been done by referendum until this year with the introduction of Act 41, which I'll talk about in a little bit here. But we know about these two particular annexations thanks to a data set that a volunteer has been working on. There's a project called the Pennsylvania Local Geohistory Project, where essentially volunteer labor is taking a look at historical records in county courthouses around the Commonwealth and looking up old annexations and laying them out on maps and saying, do the county records reflect this? And here are two examples where they do not. And my understanding is that PennDOT has since recognized those two annexations, because by happenstance of this working group, representatives from PennDOT are talking to private individuals involved in this volunteer nonprofit and basically saying, well, yep, that is a legal document that says this is a part of that community. It should be reflected on the map. And so that's a pretty challenging situation to uncover. Both of these are in excess of 70 years old. So they went 70 years not being identified in the mapping situation. Okay. Here is an example of a third kind of situation where we see some map issues. This is actually some documentation from recent litigation that this has been resolved, but it was resolved through a long, arduous process. This is two townships in north central PA where they have historically split this large island that's kind of between the two townships. And in this case, the old metes and bounds of the description about where the line is dividing the island relies on a phrase of the old sugar. Well, the old sugar in this reference is believed to be an old sugar maple from 1810 that is not there anymore. And under the existing process to fight it out in court, essentially one township had to challenge the line, and of which there were 3 different proposed lines, and say that we think that what you describe as kind of the commonly accepted belief about where the line is, and that's a sort of layman's expression for what we sometimes call the doctrine of acquiescence. It's been this way long enough that we give up and we may as well treat it as the line. The township was like, we're not happy with that. We're not happy with you saying that this is what has become the generally accepted line. We think that's in virtue an annexation, and you didn't go through the referendum process. So why should we accept it? So they had the County Court of Common Pleas appoint boundary commissioners to go and do a survey, and it literally involves walking through a field, kicking the ground, looking for an old stone that may or may not be an existing marker. And the findings of fact that the Commonwealth Court reviewed involve things like looking at a white stone and trying to determine, is this a rock or is this a marker? Because they just were not marked particularly well. So this is, I wanted to highlight this particular one because it really gets to the core issue of how difficult it is to resolve these particular issues. And these two townships spent thousands of dollars on litigation on this, including taking it all the way to the Commonwealth Court to work out some appellate issues. Now, I think this is a decent point for us to highlight that one particular area where there might be some promise going forward is through a piece of legislation that we worked through the process this year, resulting in Act 41, which is an attempt to alleviate some of the challenges. And I'll outline a few of them. Number one, you have the challenge of the information doesn't get to where it was supposed to go. Going back to this idea of the annexations, if these annexations had happened and that information had gotten sent to the county recorder of deeds and to various Commonwealth agencies, there might be less conflict in this data. Very often that's not the case. Very often the two communities send the information to the recorder of deeds, and that's it. So Act 41 now has a unified reporting requirement that should get that information to PennDOT, DCED, DEP, I believe, Department of Education, a lot of different state agencies that have some vested interest in this information. And then number two, it makes the process for challenging these uniform among classifications of government. Now that on its own doesn't solve a lot of problems. It does resolve what I would call stupid lawyer problems of you have a different process in a borough and a different process in a township. And inevitably, you're going to have a situation where a borough touches a township. And then in making those legal filings, you have to deal with the fact that those processes are slightly different. They're not in an important way. But the other thing that it does is it actually allows for the first time for the parties to settle these things with actual legal authority. So if you look at something like the doctrine of acquiescence and say, if we didn't have any other better information, we might agree to just say, that's our best information, that's good enough for us. One goal with Act 41 is to flip it on its head and say, if we're starting from a position that this line is good enough for us, go record it at the recorder of deeds and we'll call it a day. Now, obviously that has vested rights issues for affected landowners. So if an affected landowner or a certain, petition of the population approaches either of their municipalities and says, we're not happy with you settling this boundary here, then they can send it to a referendum. But we're trying to come up with an alternative to an expensive legal process for working these out. And I'll say one third thing. One third thing about Act 41 is it's also an effort to allow those annexations to happen by agreement as well. A lot of times annexations happen when you have large property developers who say, I want to build something. It's going to span two communities and I don't want to be in two different jurisdictions. I don't want to need one code enforcement official on this half of my warehouse and one code enforcement official on that half of my warehouse or something along those lines. And so very often in the deed transfer process, there's negotiation with municipalities saying, hey, could we actually do a land swap here? You give us this corner of property, we'll give you this green space that you might turn into a park, that kind of thing. And so with the same caveats of landowner vested rights to put it to a referendum if you'd want to, Act 41 opens the door for the first time of basically being able to do those kinds of property swaps, annexations by agreement. Here's another one that I think is pretty interesting to look at, and essentially a version of the doctrine of acquiescence in play. So I look at this and to me, the PennDOT boundary is, we don't know, but we know one side and we know the other. So we drew a straight line. And if you ask the PennDOT folks who work on this, they would kind of agree on this particular one because this strange boundary is almost definitely never reflective of what the political boundary was between these two townships. So what you're seeing that's a little different in this image than some of the prior ones is the yellow content in the upper half of the image are the individual lot parcels that appear on that township's tax map. And the reason that we're showing this is because someone noticed, and I'm not taking credit for this, that the jagged jagged orange line that is at the county's map actually closely follows for a long period of time those exact parcel lines. In the course of history, that's actually pretty uncommon. A lot of times, if you have large pieces of property that adjoin a municipal line, they're going to go right through it. There's tax rules for how that's handled in all of the municipal codes. But the idea that this would turn into a kind of a neat arrangement of jagged parcels would be a pretty uncommon accident of history. And the best information that folks that have researched this have looked at is at some point the municipalities gave up and just said, we're just going to follow these property lines and that's as good as we have. But we don't have a legal conclusion of that particular thing. Then census drew an approximation of that near the county line. I mean, it is really strange sometimes when you look at these maps as to where that kind of information comes from. But in some ways, that acceptance of following the parcel lines is a form of acquiescence in practice. Folks have said it's good enough for us. It's not disputed. These two townships aren't arguing with each other, those kinds of things. So hopefully this is something that if it's ever, there's a reason for dispute, they might actually settle it using the provisions of Act 41. And finally, the last one, this is an example of a geometry where maybe the most likely scenario is that the information on record shows a pretty good sign of how big and what the shape of the municipality is, more or less, even though there's some contradictory stuff. But anchoring it in space has led to some problems because you see three different versions of this rectangle. And I do apologize. The dotted rectangle appears to be a third data source that we actually weren't able to identify. It's in the base map that we used for this. But we thought we would show it because it's, again, a third source of information showing a different set of imagery for this particular township. Well, this particular borough in relation to the township that surrounds it. So did want to highlight some different images for what these kind of issues can look like throughout the Commonwealth. I don't know. I talked for a while. Do you have anything you want to say, Jaren?
Sure. I think one takeaway from doing this is the realization that these different maps are meant to kind of do different things. Like PennDOT's Munbound system is largely based, mapping and making sure fuel allocations are as close as possible. So they're not going to be as concerned with the historic political boundaries, if your municipal boundary is in the middle of a field versus where the road ends. And I think going forward, as these maps become more and more technical and more detail oriented, they may come to a point at becoming unworkable.
Definitely. And with some newer technology coming online, both in the public sector and private sector, we'll see that play out in real ways. Our 911 system is being converted from the traditional addressing model of here's a list of addresses in your community, go find them, to the next gen 911 system, which is a nationwide model, lives on a map. It identifies the specific GPS coordinates of the various structures that are served by 911, and having confusing base maps serving that system is really difficult. And as I understand it, PEMA, which is deploying Next Gen 911 in Pennsylvania, is leaning on that PennDOT system a little bit for some of their base maps, which is because there's a lot of known issues with the census map. And the same can be said for conflicts that come up with things like PA1 call. You're going to dig in your backyard and you don't know if you're contacting the right political officials. We already talked about elections a little bit, but there's plenty of other governmental entities that are involved. What's interesting is your governments now are also buying services from the private sector that use mapping data. They're going out and they're downloading apps that someone has created using a map layer to say, where are all of the nature trails that are available in your community? Well, sure, that might be a relatively lightweight issue, but that data set that's in that mapping software contributes to some of the confusion that the public feels about how accurate are these maps and what source is the map using. Sometimes they're using the Google Maps API, which is none of these. We actually were researching that recently and discovered that Google has kind of a policy of downloading. What did you say? They download census?
So
Yeah, go ahead and tell them about it.
So because we just went down the rabbit hole with these maps. Google, for example, uses census's raw data first, and then from there they buy third-party vendors that sell other geospatial data. If you go to the map with the this one, we actually pulled up this map on Google to kind of compare it, and we noticed that in this case, for the most part, Google follows the county line closer to anyone else. Like, it even deviates from census in some places. So Google certainly takes, bits from different parts from different components of the maps to kind of produce their own. So I think, to Kris's point, when you have the public utilizing these resources, it becomes more and more important for them to be as accurate as possible.
And so one question that obviously comes from all of this is, where do we go from here? There's not going to be an easy administrative solution, no matter what data set gets pulled to say, okay, this is as close to an official set of maps as there can be. To actually go through and bring all of these things into alignment, it's a lot of time, a lot of treasure, a lot of human resources to do so. We have some optimism that the tools in Act 41 might be helpful in that. And then there's also some work going on with coming to a finalized letter of agreement between the Commonwealth and the Census Bureau with the boundary and annexation survey. Jaren mentioned that earlier in this part, where the census basically says the best way to tell us about changes in your official maps is by utilizing this survey as a point to transfer data, but without a clear authority as to who is the right person in the Commonwealth to update the census with that data. That can lead to its own problems. So there's some work going forward on trying to come up with an ironclad data sharing agreement with Census. And in fact, right now there's also a pilot program going on where Census is working with, I believe, 3 counties, looking at their data, trying to dig a little deeper and understand their records on hand and those kinds of things. So this isn't one of those reports where we can come out and say, here's a clear set of recommendations. This is instead one of those reports where we say, you might be surprised to learn that this is a real part of being Pennsylvanian. And, as these issues develop, like, you shouldn't be surprised when this becomes a challenge, and here's some of the road ahead. So I hope you found this interesting, and we're happy to answer any questions, even though we do not know hardly anything about GIS.
I like the caveat.
Oh, here comes a GIS professional. I'm terrified.
So yes, as a GIS professional, I truly appreciate this topic getting some attention at the state level. This has been a challenge for a long time, and it's becoming more acute because the level of accuracy is increasing, and we're still looking at 1850 surveys for this kind of boundary information. I'm particularly interested in what sort of results Act 41 can provide. So I know Act 41 is relatively young. Has anything come of that yet? Has anything gone through that procedure?
Well, it was signed into law, I believe, at the very end of June, maybe July 1st, which means it took effect officially like less than 35 days ago.
Okay.
So it's definitely going to take some time. We know of in private conversations of three situations where municipalities were basically like saying, hurry up and pass Act 41 because we want to resolve live issues. So we may see some of those issues hit the press maybe later this year.
Okay. Yeah. So understanding how those issues work through that system is really going to help other municipalities throughout the state, because there's a lot of municipalities that don't have as pressing as problems, but there are a lot of municipalities that, if you look back at, the surveys from the 1800s and look at, the landscape now with how the parcels are being taxed between municipality A and municipality B, the two really don't align.
Yeah.
And it's going to be very helpful to give these municipalities a mechanism that is cordial and non-confrontational. The boundary commission process scared a lot of municipalities away from even looking at these types of issues. So hopefully with Act 41, and being able to point out some success stories soon that come through, that is going to really help some municipalities start re-engaging in this, and not just sweeping things under the rug and say, we don't want to go through the boundary commission process, so we're not even going to look at this thing.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree. And the thing is like, we don't even know where some of these issues will pop up. I scrolled back to this one briefly because in both of these cases, you can see where in the municipality on the right-hand lines that are really well aligned, you can't even see the green, and the purple and the fuchsia are all together. That's the edge of a city. That boundary looks really good by comparison to some other ones. But if you have a property owner along one of those property lines that still discovers an issue, and it just so happens that all three sources of data were wrong in the same way, you could have a legal challenge to, say, a tax map on the basis of that, and suddenly raise real questions about the quality of all three surveys at the same time, or more. I mean, we're showing three layers here. As you know, there can often be even more. So, any other questions?
My question is with the census map, and we've run into like some municipalities where their census dropped below the magic number. Are any of these like that have like egregious boundary differences between the census and the PennDOT one? Does it affect those kinds of those municipalities?
I have no idea. I'm happy to say that because it's a lot of the more interesting things that have been found in these maps, and I don't want to take credit for discovering all of these things. This was an open call and email to folks on this working group saying like, hey, send me some weird pictures, and then finding the right way to package them. But a lot of GIS professionals have found these things because they're scrolling their communities and they go, that doesn't look right. So is there a systematic way to assess that? Yes, it would take a lot of time and treasure. There are certain places, like I know that there was an effort between, I cannot remember which two counties. One of them is Tioga, maybe Tioga and Potter. They had a common boundary, and they recently had a survey go where they went back and found all of the old monuments. They aligned all of the boundaries, and just to get a good map of what the legal line was. Not even to say that there was a difference in what the legal line was. It's just that what was on the map was not what was showing up in real life. And that's great when it happens, and census accepted it, PennDOT accepted it, the counties reflected it in their boundaries. But that doesn't happen by accident. It happens because somebody chose to. We found the 24 houses in the first example, just literally by scrolling the Commonwealth for a while with this particular map because it shows the houses on it. And we were like, that's a good one. There's a place in Harrisburg, of all places. Harrisburg is a pretty well-defined city. It's an old city. It's in a county with a professional GIS department, which really the resources that are available in a lot of counties are really good. It's quite an impressive area of county effort. But we found a strip mall where it was like a pizza shop and a pharmacy and something else that's just tucked in a tiny corner, where on one side it's Harrisburg and the other side it's Swatara Township. And it's like, that's a big taxpayer. You probably really want to know which one of these is accurate. So.
So the commission recently did legislation on digital submission of county or municipal zoning maps, I believe, and just allowing that pre-existing practice to be, you know, allowed in the MPC.
Yeah.
You said there was no like systematic way to update these, but does the MPC have any kind of systematic updates of comprehensive plans or zoning maps where municipal governments could tag on like the GIS aspect of defining their boundaries, or does the boundary definition exist within municipal
I think
ordinances
it's
outside
mostly,
of that?
yeah, I think it's mostly an apples and oranges situation.
Okay.
You know, the things that are going in the planning ordinances are there to say like, here's how to use the municipality you have. Now, certainly the accuracy of the official map adopted in the MPC is important, but when they're going through their comprehensive planning process, I don't think resurveying boundaries is typically a part of that. So that's a place where I don't think that data is becoming part of fixing the data set. It's more along the lines of making sure that there are good instructions in law about exactly what entity you tell when municipal boundaries change. So, you know, we've had the Merger and Consolidation Act since the mid 70s. And also following a constitutional change. And it says, when you merge or consolidate, tell a grown-up. And here's the list of grown-ups who should know. And its analog for boundary change didn't pass in 72. It's actually, I believe it was a commission bill, and it just didn't move. And essentially, the work on Act 41 started with picking up that 50-year-old bill and say, well, let's try this again. And so different communities looked at the mandate different ways, because all they had to steer them was Article 9, Section 8 of the Constitution, which says in about 50 words, hold a referendum. And then there was a 1903 law that was partially repealed that said you should tell the Court of Quarter Sessions and, I don't know, the constable. But no modern law kind of guiding how you're supposed to make these kind of reports. And that's one of the reasons why the situation got as far out of hand as it did, especially with annexations. Do we have one online?
Just trying to remember it as I come up. So it's more of a comment. They just said about, appropriating relief, like fireman's relief and things like that can also be an issue when you're not really sure where those lines lie.
Yes. Can we send these good people home?
I think now is the time, Chris. Well, thank you all for attending our second annual symposium. I appreciate you hanging out and listening to all the sessions. I think we had a pretty good program this year. We hope this event provided meaningful opportunities for education and future potential collaboration between academia professionals and legislative staffers and practitioners. And I particularly want to thank Julia Fry on our staff for her yeoman's work in getting this together. She put an extraordinary amount of work into this. Marty Toth on our team as well was also instrumental in the planning. And of course, our tech genius, Kris Gazsi, for keeping everybody on screen during the day. So once again,
Senate's
we really
doing all the hard
appreciate
work.
that. What's that?
I said the Senate's doing all the hard work today.
So we appreciate you participating, and we hope to see you next year. Thank you very much.